The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, India's presidential palace, as senior guard Rajesh Kumar adjusted his ceremonial uniform for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders over his 15 years of service. Today marked another routine day in what outsiders considered the most prestigious security assignment in the country. But Rajesh knew better than most that routine could shatter in an instant. At 42, Rajesh had seen 3 presidents come and go, witnessed countless state visits, and stood silent sentinel during moments that would later fill history books. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had spent decades under the Delhi sun, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, qualities that had earned him the respect of his superiors and the trust of those he was sworn to protect. The presidential palace buzzed with its usual morning activity. Staff members hurried through corridors carrying important documents. Gardeners tended to the meticulously maintained lawns, and security personnel conducted their routine checks. Everything appeared normal, yet Rajesh couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Perhaps it was the way certain officials avoided eye contact, or the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. His instincts, honed by years of service, whispered warnings he couldn't quite articulate. Colonel Vikram Singh, the head of presidential security, emerged from the main building with purposeful strides. His military bearing was impeccable as always, but Rajesh noticed the slight tension in his jaw, a tell he had learned to recognize over their years of working together. The colonel's uniform was pressed to perfection, his medals gleaming in the sunlight, yet something in his demeanor suggested urgency beneath the composed exterior. The presidential palace grounds stretched before them like a carefully orchestrated stage. Every tree, every pathway, every security checkpoint had been designed with both beauty and protection in mind. The red sandstone architecture stood as a testament to India's rich heritage, while the modern security systems hidden throughout represented the nation's commitment to safeguarding its highest office. Rajesh had walked these paths thousands of times, but today they felt different, charged with an electricity he couldn't identify. As the morning progressed, unusual activities began to unfold around the complex. Additional security personnel arrived unannounced, their presence creating subtle ripples of curiosity among the regular staff. Phone calls were made in hushed tones, and important-looking documents were passed between officials with uncommon urgency. Rajesh observed these developments with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice anomalies in routine patterns. The first concrete sign that something significant was developing came when Rajesh noticed several black vehicles with tinted windows arriving at intervals throughout the morning. These weren't the usual diplomatic cars or scheduled appointments he was accustomed to seeing. The passengers who emerged moved with the purposeful urgency of people carrying weighty responsibilities, their expressions grave and focused. Inside the palace, President Meera Sharma was conducting her regular morning briefing with senior advisors. Known for her calm demeanor and thoughtful decision-making, she had earned widespread respect during her tenure. However, the information being presented to her this morning was testing even her considerable composure. Intelligence reports, security assessments, and urgent recommendations filled the conference table, each document bearing classifications that restricted their contents to only the highest levels of government. The situation that was rapidly developing involved sensitive matters of national security that required immediate and decisive action. Years of diplomatic protocols and established procedures suddenly seemed inadequate for the challenge at hand. The president listened intently as her advisors outlined various scenarios, each carrying significant implications for the country's stability and international standing. Meanwhile, in the Security Command Center, monitoring screens displayed feeds from dozens of cameras positioned throughout the complex and its surroundings. Duty officers tracked movements, analyzed patterns, and maintained constant communication with field personnel. The technological sophistication of these systems represented the pinnacle of protective intelligence gathering, yet they could only be as effective as the human judgment that interpreted their data. Rajesh's radio crackled to life with routine position reports from other guards stationed around the perimeter. Each check-in followed established protocols, but he detected subtle variations in tone and timing that suggested heightened awareness throughout the security detail. His colleagues were professionals who had trained extensively for various contingencies, yet the current situation seemed to fall outside the parameters of their usual preparations. The afternoon brought an escalation in activity levels that could no longer be dismissed as routine variations. Senior government officials arrived for unscheduled meetings, their conversations conducted behind closed doors with unprecedented security precautions. The palace staff began implementing protocols typically reserved for the highest levels of alert, though no formal announcement had been made regarding the nature of the situation. Colonel Singh gathered his senior security personnel for a briefing that would later be remembered as a turning point in the day's events. The meeting took place in a secure conference room where classified matters were routinely discussed. The colonel's expression was grave as he addressed the assembled guards, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver information that would test their professional resolve and personal convictions. The intelligence reports he shared painted a picture of developing threats that required immediate protective measures. However, the specific nature of these threats and the recommended responses raised questions that went beyond standard security protocols. The guards listened intently as their commander outlined scenarios that challenged their understanding of their roles and responsibilities in protecting the presidency. As the briefing concluded, each guard was assigned specific duties that differed from their normal routines. These assignments carried implicit expectations that they would follow orders without question, regardless of their personal feelings about the situations they might encounter. The military tradition of unquestioning obedience to lawful orders formed the foundation of their service, yet the circumstances they were facing seemed to exist in gray areas where the definition of lawful might be subject to interpretation. Rajesh returned to his post with his mind racing through the implications of what he had heard. His position near the main entrance provided him with a vantage point to observe the continuing arrival of officials and the subtle changes in security posture throughout the complex. The responsibility weighing on his shoulders had grown heavier with each piece of information he had received during the briefing. The evening shift change brought fresh personnel to their posts, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension and uncertainty. Conversations between guards were brief and professional, yet underlying currents of concern were evident to those who knew how to read the signs. The situation they were facing represented uncharted territory for most of them, despite their extensive training and experience. As darkness fell over the presidential complex, the lights that illuminated the grounds took on an almost surreal quality. The familiar surroundings that Rajesh had known for years now seemed transformed by the weight of the decisions being made within the palace walls. The night ahead promised to test not only his professional skills, but also his personal principles in ways he had never anticipated. The command that would soon echo through the corridors of power was taking shape in the highest levels of government. Those responsible for making such decisions were weighing options that carried profound implications for the nation's future. The guards who would be expected to implement these decisions remained largely unaware of the specific details, yet they could sense that something unprecedented was developing. Rajesh's thoughts turned to his family waiting at home, his wife who worried about his safety despite the prestigious nature of his position, and his 2 children who took pride in their father's service to the country. The oath he had taken years earlier suddenly felt more significant than ever, its words carrying implications he was only beginning to fully understand. The night ahead would test whether his commitment to duty could withstand the challenges that lay ahead. The stage was set for events that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. The decisions made in the coming hours would echo through the corridors of history, affecting not only those directly involved, but the entire nation they served. Rajesh stood at his post, unaware that he was about to become a central figure in a drama that would test the very foundations of constitutional governance and personal integrity. The presidential palace, with all its grandeur and symbolic importance, was about to become the setting for a confrontation between duty and conscience, between orders and principles, between the immediate demands of authority and the eternal requirements of moral judgment. The shocking command that was taking shape in the minds of those in power would soon echo through these hallowed halls, but the response it would receive was still unknown. The first light of dawn revealed an unprecedented scene at the presidential palace. Throughout the night, a steady stream of unmarked vehicles had arrived, disgorging passengers who moved with the purposeful urgency of people carrying momentous responsibilities. Rajesh had maintained his vigil at the main entrance, documenting each arrival while trying to piece together the emerging picture from fragments of overheard conversations and observed behaviors. Colonel Singh appeared at his office window on the second floor, his silhouette framed against the interior lights that had burned throughout the night. The security chief had clearly not slept, his usually impeccable appearance showing signs of the stress that comes with managing unprecedented situations. Phone conversations had continued almost continuously, each call seeming to add another layer of complexity to whatever crisis was unfolding within the palace walls. The morning briefing that awaited Rajesh and his colleagues promised to be unlike any they had previously experienced. As they assembled in the secure conference room, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and underlying tension. These were seasoned professionals who had trained for various contingencies, yet the current situation seemed to exist outside the parameters of their usual preparations and protocols. Intelligence reports spread across the conference table painted a picture of developing threats that challenged conventional understanding of security requirements. The documents bore the highest classification markings, their contents restricted to only those with absolute need-to-know clearance. Maps, photographs, and detailed analyses suggested scenarios that would test not only their professional capabilities but their personal resolve as well. Colonel Singh began the briefing with uncharacteristic hesitation, his voice carrying undertones that suggested he was struggling with the information he was required to convey. The threats outlined in the intelligence reports were unlike anything they had encountered in their collective years of service. These were not external dangers from hostile nations or terrorist organizations, but internal challenges that struck at the very heart of constitutional governance. The situation had developed rapidly over the previous weeks, with intelligence agencies reporting activities that suggested organized efforts to undermine the legitimate authority of the presidency. Phone intercepts, surveillance reports, and financial records pointed to a network of individuals working to destabilize the government through means that fell into gray areas between legal political opposition and treasonous conspiracy. President Sharma herself had been briefed on these developments. Her reaction characterized by those present as one of profound concern, mixed with determination to protect the constitutional order she had sworn to uphold. The president's advisors had presented her with various options for responding to the threats, each carrying significant implications for both immediate security and long-term democratic stability. The recommended course of action that emerged from these high-level consultations involved measures that pushed the boundaries of executive authority. Legal scholars within the government had provided opinions supporting the constitutionality of the proposed actions, while others had raised questions about precedent and potential abuse of power. The president faced decisions that would define her legacy and potentially alter the future trajectory of the nation. As Colonel Singh continued his briefing, the specific roles assigned to the security detail became clearer. They would be required to implement protective measures that went beyond their usual duties of physical security and crowd control. The assignments involved actions that would directly impact other government officials and potentially civilian citizens who had been identified as participants in the alleged conspiracy. The legal framework supporting these actions was complex and subject to interpretation. Executive orders had been prepared that would authorize extraordinary measures justified by the doctrine of national emergency and constitutional preservation. However, the implementation of these orders would require security personnel to make judgments about lawful authority and legitimate resistance that fell outside their normal training parameters. Rajesh listened to these developments with growing unease. His 15 years of service have been built on a foundation of clear hierarchies and unambiguous orders. The situation being described challenged his understanding of the proper relationship between military authority and civilian governance. The oath he had taken required obedience to lawful orders. But determining the lawfulness of orders in unprecedented circumstances required judgments he felt unqualified to make. The other guards in the briefing room displayed varying reactions to the information being presented. Some maintained the stoic expressions typical of military professionals receiving operational orders, while others showed subtle signs of the internal conflict that comes with confronting situations that challenge fundamental assumptions about duty and authority. The unity of purpose that usually characterized their operations was showing signs of strain. Colonel Singh concluded his briefing by emphasizing the critical importance of maintaining operational security and following established chains of command. He reminded the assembled guards that their oath of service transcended personal opinions and required them to trust in the judgment of their superiors. The implications were clear. Questioning orders or failing to implement assigned duties would be considered acts of insubordination with serious consequences. As the guards dispersed to their assigned positions, conversations were notably subdued. The camaraderie that usually characterized shift changes was replaced by a more serious atmosphere, reflecting the weight of the responsibilities they had been given. Each man was processing the implications of the morning's briefing and trying to reconcile their professional obligations with their personal convictions. Rajesh returned to his post at the main entrance, with his mind churning through the complex web of considerations that had been presented. The familiar surroundings of the presidential complex now seemed charged with new significance. Every visitor, every phone call, every routine activity carried potential implications in the context of the developing situation. The first test of the new protocols came when a group of opposition politicians arrived for what they believed was a scheduled meeting with the president. Their security detail and official vehicles suggested they were unaware of the changed circumstances within the palace. Rajesh observed their approach with heightened attention, knowing that their reception would likely differ from their expectations. The politicians were greeted according to established protocols, but subtle changes in security procedures became apparent to those trained to notice such details. Additional screening measures were implemented, and the usual courtesies were delivered with a formality that suggested underlying tension. The visitors seemed to sense that something was different, though they couldn't immediately identify the source of their unease. Inside the palace, President Sharma was meeting with her core advisory team to finalize the implementation of the measures they had been planning throughout the night. The decisions being made would affect not only the immediate security situation, but the fundamental balance of power within the government. Constitutional scholars, military advisors, and intelligence officials provided input on a course of action that would test the limits of executive authority. The legal justification for the proposed actions rested on interpretations of emergency powers that had rarely been invoked in the nation's history. Precedents from other democracies facing similar challenges provided some guidance, but the specific circumstances they faced were unique enough to require original analysis and judgment. The president weighed these considerations against her responsibility to protect the constitutional order from what intelligence reports characterized as unprecedented threats. As the afternoon progressed, the first concrete implementations of the new security measures began to take effect. Phone communications in and out of the palace were subjected to additional monitoring protocols. Vehicle searches became more thorough, and visitor access was restricted according to revised criteria that reflected the heightened threat assessment. These changes were implemented gradually, to avoid creating obvious signs of the altered security posture. The staff within the palace began to notice these subtle changes, though few understood their full significance. Conversations became more guarded, and routine interactions carried undertones of caution that reflected the charged atmosphere. The normal rhythms of palace life were being altered by the weight of decisions being made at the highest levels of government. Rajesh's position at the main entrance provided him with a unique vantage point to observe these evolving dynamics. His experience and training allowed him to detect patterns and anomalies that might escape the notice of less experienced personnel. The responsibility for making split-second decisions about access and security was taking on new dimensions in the context of the developing crisis. The communications equipment at his disposal connected him to a network of security personnel throughout the complex and beyond. Each radio transmission carried coded information about positions, movements, and status reports that painted a picture of heightened alertness throughout the protective detail. The technology that enabled such coordination was sophisticated, but its effectiveness ultimately depended on the judgment and reliability of the human operators who used it. As evening approached, the palace grounds took on an almost surreal quality. The combination of normal activities and heightened security measures created an atmosphere of controlled tension that was palpable to anyone sensitive to such environmental cues. The decisions made in the coming hours would echo through the corridors of history, affecting not only those directly involved, but the entire democratic framework they were sworn to protect. The command that would soon test Rajesh's resolve was taking final shape in the minds of those wielding authority. The moment of reckoning was approaching when theoretical discussions about duty and conscience would give way to concrete decisions with immediate and far-reaching consequences. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define not only his own character, but the character of the institutions he served. The weight of history seemed to press down upon the presidential complex as the sun set on this extraordinary day. The decisions being made within its walls would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. The guards who would be called upon to implement these decisions remained largely unaware of their roles in the unfolding drama, yet they could sense that they were about to become participants in events that would test the very foundations of their professional and personal beliefs. Tomorrow would bring the moment when abstract principles would collide with concrete realities, when the oath of service would be tested against the demands of conscience, and when one guard's simple question would echo through the corridors of power with implications far beyond what anyone could anticipate. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the drama that would define a generation was about to begin. The morning air carried an electric tension as Rajesh took his position at the main entrance of the presidential palace. The events of the previous days had built to this moment, when theoretical discussions about authority and obedience would transform into concrete actions with irreversible consequences. The intelligence reports that had dominated high-level meetings were about to translate into operational reality, testing every principle and assumption that had guided his 15 years of service. Colonel Singh emerged from the main building earlier than usual, his stride purposeful but measured. The security chief's expression revealed nothing to casual observers. But Rajesh had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his commander's state of mind. The slight tension around his eyes, the unconscious straightening of his shoulders, and the way his hand briefly touched his service weapon all suggested that the moment they had been preparing for was finally at hand. Inside the palace, President Sharma had concluded her final consultation with constitutional lawyers and intelligence officials. The decision she faced represented one of the most challenging moments in her political career, requiring her to balance competing interpretations of executive authority, democratic principles, and national security requirements. The weight of history pressed upon her shoulders as she authorized actions that would be scrutinized and debated for generations to come. The legal framework supporting the president's decision rested on emergency powers provisions that had been written into the Constitution but never before invoked under such circumstances. Scholarly opinions on the legitimacy of these actions varied widely, with some arguing for broad executive discretion during national crises and others warning about the dangers of precedent and potential abuse of power. The president had chosen to err on the side of protecting what she saw as the constitutional order itself. The first concrete implementation of the new directives began with a secure communication to Colonel Singh's office. The encrypted message contained specific instructions that had been months in the planning but were now being activated for immediate execution. The language was precise and unambiguous, leaving no room for interpretation or hesitation in their implementation. The moment for theoretical discussions had passed. The time for action had arrived. Colonel Singh gathered his senior security personnel in the briefing room that had become the nerve center for planning these extraordinary operations. The maps, photographs, and intelligence reports that covered the conference table represented weeks of analysis and preparation. Each document bore the highest security classifications, restricting their contents to only those with absolute need-to-know clearance and sworn oaths of secrecy. The colonel's voice carried an unusual gravity as he began outlining the specific assignments that would be implemented within the next few hours. The operations he described went far beyond the usual scope of presidential security, extending into areas that traditionally fell under the jurisdiction of other agencies and branches of government. The justification for this expansion of authority rested on interpretations of emergency powers that pushed the boundaries of established precedent. The targets of these operations included several high-ranking government officials, opposition leaders, and civilian activists who had been identified through intelligence gathering as participants in what was characterized as a coordinated effort to undermine legitimate governmental authority. The evidence supporting these allegations varied in quality and conclusiveness, ranging from intercepted communications to financial records to behavioral analyses that relied heavily on interpretation and inference. Rajesh listened to these briefings with growing concern about the implications of what he was being asked to implement. His training had prepared him for protecting the presidency from external threats and managing crowd control during public events, but the current assignments required him to take actions against other government officials and civilian citizens that seemed to fall outside his understanding of legitimate security operations. The specific role assigned to Rajesh involved controlling access to certain areas of the palace while ensuring that designated individuals could be detained for questioning without creating public disturbances or media attention. The operations were designed to appear routine from external perspectives while implementing extraordinary measures that would effectively neutralize what intelligence reports characterized as immediate threats to constitutional governance. The legal basis for these detentions rested on interpretations of national security legislation that granted broad discretionary powers to executive authorities during declared emergencies. However, the declaration of such an emergency had been handled through internal executive processes rather than through the legislative consultations that critics argued were required by constitutional provisions. The legitimacy of these actions would likely be debated in courts and academic institutions for years to come. As the briefing concluded, Colonel Singh emphasized the critical importance of operational security and absolute loyalty to the chain of command. He reminded the assembled personnel that their oath of service required them to trust in the judgment of their superiors and to implement lawful orders regardless of personal opinions or concerns. The implications were clear. Questioning these assignments or failing to execute them properly would be considered acts of insubordination with serious professional and legal consequences. The guards dispersed to their assigned positions with an atmosphere of focused professionalism that masked underlying currents of uncertainty and concern. Conversations were brief and strictly operational, avoiding the personal discussions that usually characterize their interactions during routine shifts. Each individual was processing the implications of their assignments while trying to maintain the disciplined mindset required for effective performance of their duties. Rajesh returned to his post at the main entrance, with his mind racing through the complex web of considerations that surrounded his assigned responsibilities. The familiar surroundings of the presidential complex now seemed transformed by the knowledge of what was about to unfold within its walls. Every routine interaction carried potential significance in the context of the operations that were being implemented. The first indication that the new protocols were being activated came when Rajesh noticed unusual communication patterns among the security personnel stationed throughout the complex. Radio transmissions increased in frequency and carried coded language that indicated heightened operational status. Vehicle movements around the perimeter followed patterns that differed from normal security routines, suggesting that additional resources were being positioned for the anticipated operations. The morning proceeded with an outward appearance of normalcy that concealed the extraordinary measures being implemented throughout the palace. Staff members continued their routine duties while remaining unaware of the scope and significance of the security operations that were unfolding around them. The careful coordination required to maintain this facade of normalcy while executing complex tactical operations represented months of detailed planning and preparation. President Sharma maintained her regular schedule of meetings and appointments, providing no external indication of the momentous decisions she had authorized. Her public demeanor remained composed and presidential, even as she privately grappled with the implications of actions that would define her legacy and potentially alter the trajectory of democratic governance in the nation. The burden of leadership had never felt heavier than it did during these critical hours. The first targets of the security operations began arriving at the palace according to schedules that had been carefully orchestrated to ensure their presence when the operations commenced. These individuals believed they were attending routine meetings or ceremonial functions, unaware that intelligence assessments had identified them as threats to constitutional order requiring immediate neutralization through detention and questioning. Rajesh observed the arrival of these visitors with heightened awareness of his role in the unfolding drama. His position at the main entrance made him a critical component in ensuring that the operations proceeded according to plan while maintaining the appearance of normal palace activities. The weight of responsibility pressed upon his shoulders as he realized that his actions in the coming hours would have consequences far beyond his usual duties as a security guard. The communication device at his disposal connected him to a network of personnel who were simultaneously implementing various components of the overall operation. Each radio transmission provided updates on positions, movements, and status reports that painted a picture of coordinated activity throughout the complex and beyond. The sophistication of these communications reflected the extensive planning and preparation that had preceded this moment. As the morning progressed, the subtle signs of heightened security measures became more apparent to those trained to recognize such indicators. Additional screening procedures were implemented for all visitors, and movement within certain areas of the palace was restricted, according to protocols that had been developed specifically for these operations. The changes were gradual enough to avoid creating obvious alarm while ensuring effective implementation of the enhanced security measures. The psychological pressure of maintaining operational security while executing unprecedented actions began to weigh heavily on all personnel involved in the operations. The normal camaraderie and informal interactions that characterized routine shifts were replaced by a more formal and focused atmosphere that reflected the gravity of their collective responsibilities. Each individual was aware that they were participating in events that would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. The stage was now set for the moment when abstract principles would collide with concrete realities, when years of training and preparation would be tested against unprecedented circumstances, and when individual character would be measured against institutional loyalty. The command that would soon echo through the corridors of power was about to be issued, and the response it would receive remained unknown to all participants in this historic drama. The weight of history seemed to permeate every corner of the presidential complex as the critical moment approached. The decisions being implemented carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate security concerns that had prompted them, potentially reshaping the relationship between executive authority and democratic governance for future generations. The guards who would be called upon to execute these decisions remained largely unaware of their roles in this larger historical narrative, yet they could sense that they were about to become participants in events that would test fundamental assumptions about duty, loyalty, and moral courage. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching when theoretical discussions about constitutional authority and individual conscience would give way to concrete actions with immediate and irreversible consequences. The moment of reckoning arrived with the distinctive crackle of Rajesh's radio communication device. Colonel Singh's voice carried through the static with unprecedented gravity, delivering words that would forever change the trajectory of events within the presidential palace. The command that followed represented the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation, yet its actual articulation still carried the power to shock those who heard it for the first time. "All units, implement Protocol 7 immediately," the colonel's voice announced across the secure communications network. Designated individuals are to be detained pending security questioning. Resistance should be minimized through professional restraint. Maintain operational silence and await further instructions. This is not a drill. Acknowledge receipt. The responses came quickly from security personnel stationed throughout the complex, each confirmation representing another step toward the implementation of measures that pushed the boundaries of established precedent. Rajesh found himself at the center of operations that would be remembered as either a necessary defense of constitutional order or an unprecedented abuse of executive authority, depending on one's perspective and the ultimate outcome of events. The first target of these extraordinary measures was Deputy Minister Ashok Malhotra, a longtime opposition figure who had arrived at the palace believing he was attending a routine consultation meeting with the president's policy advisors. His vehicle had passed through the main entrance under Rajesh's observation just minutes before the operational command was issued, and now he found himself unwittingly at the center of a constitutional crisis. Malhotra's security detail consisted of 2 junior officers who were not privy to the intelligence assessments that had led to his identification as a threat to national security. Their confusion and concern became apparent as palace security personnel approached their positions, with instructions that contradicted normal protocols for handling visiting government officials. The potential for confrontation escalated rapidly as competing interpretations of authority and legitimacy collided in real time. Rajesh received specific instructions to secure the main entrance and prevent any unauthorized departures while the detention operations were being carried out throughout the complex. His position made him a critical control point for ensuring that the operations proceeded according to plan without creating public disturbances that might attract media attention or compromise operational security. The weight of this responsibility pressed heavily upon his shoulders as he contemplated the implications of his actions. The second individual targeted by the security operations was Senator Priya Khanna, a vocal critic of recent government policies who had been identified through intelligence analysis as a potential coordinator of opposition activities. Her arrival at the palace had been timed to coincide with what she believed was a ceremonial function, but intelligence reports suggested that her true purpose involved coordination with other opposition figures to plan activities that could undermine governmental stability. The evidence supporting these allegations against Senator Khanna consisted primarily of intercepted communications, financial records showing unexplained transactions, and behavioral analyses that relied heavily on interpretation and inference. The quality and conclusiveness of this evidence would likely be debated extensively in legal proceedings, but for the moment it provided sufficient justification for the extraordinary measures being implemented by executive authority. As the detention operations began throughout the palace, Rajesh found himself confronting a situation that challenged every assumption he had held about his role and responsibilities as a presidential security guard. The individuals being detained included elected officials and prominent citizens whose rights and freedoms were supposedly protected by the same constitutional order he had sworn to defend. The paradox of protecting democracy through undemocratic means created internal conflicts that his training had not prepared him to resolve. The legal framework supporting these detentions remained complex and controversial, even among the government's own legal advisors. Some argued that emergency powers provisions granted broad discretionary authority to executive officials during national crises, while others contended that the actions being taken exceeded constitutional limits and violated established precedents for the separation of powers between different branches of government. Colonel Singh's voice crackled through the radio again, with updated instructions as the operations progressed. Security Checkpoint Alpha. Maintain position and document all attempted departures. Any resistance should be handled with appropriate force, while minimizing public visibility. Remember that operational security is paramount to the success of these measures. The authority for these actions comes directly from the highest levels of government. The mention of highest levels of government carried obvious implications about presidential authorization, yet Rajesh found himself questioning the legitimacy of orders that seemed to contradict fundamental principles of democratic governance and individual rights. His 15 years of service had been built upon a foundation of clear hierarchies and unambiguous commands, but the current situation existed in gray areas where the definition of lawful authority was subject to interpretation and debate. The first signs of resistance to the detention operations came when Deputy Minister Malhotra's security detail attempted to contact their own superiors for clarification of the situation. Their radio communications were intercepted and blocked by palace security systems, creating additional tensions as competing claims of authority and legitimacy were asserted by different groups of armed personnel within the complex. The confrontation escalated when Malhotra himself demanded to speak directly with President Sharma about the circumstances of his detention. His protests that the actions being taken against him violated constitutional protections and established legal procedures created a test case for how far the security operations would extend in overriding traditional rights and protocols. The responses to his demands would establish precedents for similar situations throughout the complex. Rajesh observed these developments with growing unease about his role in implementing measures that seemed to conflict with the democratic principles he had sworn to protect. The oath he had taken years earlier suddenly felt more significant than ever. Its words carrying implications about loyalty to country versus loyalty to specific individuals or institutions that he was only beginning to fully understand and appreciate. The psychological pressure of the situation began to affect personnel throughout the complex as the reality of their actions became apparent. Guards who had expected to spend their shifts managing routine security procedures found themselves implementing extraordinary measures with far-reaching implications for democratic governance and constitutional order. The normal camaraderie and informal interactions that characterized their usual operations were replaced by tension and uncertainty. President Sharma remained secluded in her private offices with core advisors, monitoring the implementation of operations she had authorized while grappling with the implications of decisions that would define her presidency and potentially alter the trajectory of democratic governance in the nation. The burden of leadership had never felt heavier as she contemplated the consequences of actions that pushed the boundaries of executive authority into uncharted territory. The intelligence reports that had prompted these extraordinary measures continued to flow into the palace command center, providing real-time updates on the scope and nature of the alleged threats to governmental stability. Some of these reports reinforced the justifications for the current operations, while others raised questions about the quality and reliability of the evidence being used to justify such unprecedented actions against elected officials and prominent citizens. As the morning progressed, additional complications arose when family members and staff associates of the detained individuals began making inquiries about their whereabouts and status. These communications created additional security challenges as palace personnel attempted to maintain operational silence while managing growing external pressures for information and accountability. The carefully orchestrated facade of normalcy was beginning to show signs of strain. The technological sophistication of the palace security systems enabled comprehensive monitoring and control of communications in and out of the complex, but the human element remained the critical factor in determining the success or failure of the operations. Each guard was required to make individual decisions about implementing orders that challenged established norms and precedents, creating opportunities for personal conscience to conflict with institutional loyalty. Rajesh's position at the main entrance made him a witness to the full scope of the extraordinary measures being implemented throughout the presidential complex. His observations provided a unique perspective on the human dimensions of a constitutional crisis that would be analyzed and debated by scholars and politicians for generations to come. The weight of history pressed upon his shoulders as he realized that his actions would contribute to determining the outcome of events with implications far beyond his personal circumstances. The critical moment was rapidly approaching, when Rajesh would be called upon to make decisions that would test not only his professional competence, but his personal integrity and moral courage. The command that had echoed through the corridors of power was about to encounter the reality of individual conscience and the simple but profound power of a single question that would change everything. The stage was set for a confrontation between abstract authority and human judgment that would define the character of all involved and determine the fate of democratic institutions themselves. The decisive moment arrived when Colonel Singh approached Rajesh's position at the main entrance with an expression that conveyed both authority and underlying tension. The security chief's uniform remained impeccable despite the extraordinary pressures of the morning, but his eyes revealed the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond normal operational parameters. The command he was about to deliver would test not only Rajesh's obedience, but the very foundations of institutional authority and individual conscience. "Guard Kumar," Colonel Singh began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for critical operational directives. "You are hereby ordered to prevent Senator Khanna from leaving the premises. She is attempting to exit through the main entrance with documentation that could compromise ongoing security operations. Use whatever force is necessary to detain her for immediate questioning by authorized personnel. This order comes directly from the highest levels of government and requires immediate implementation." The colonel's words hung in the air between them, each syllable carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Rajesh could see Senator Khanna approaching from inside the palace, her stride purposeful but showing signs of the stress that comes with finding oneself unexpectedly at the center of extraordinary circumstances. Her expression suggested both confusion and determination as she moved toward what she believed was her rightful freedom to leave the presidential complex. Behind Senator Khanna walked two palace security officers whose presence confirmed that she was indeed under some form of official constraint, though the legal basis for such restrictions remained unclear to most observers. Their positioning suggested professional competence in managing a potentially volatile situation while maintaining the appearance of respectful treatment for a distinguished government official and elected representative of the people. For 15 years, Rajesh had followed orders without questioning their legitimacy or moral implications. His service record reflected unwavering loyalty to the chain of command and consistent performance of duties regardless of personal preferences or political opinions. The military tradition of unquestioning obedience to lawful orders had formed the foundation of his professional identity and provided clear guidance for navigating complex situations throughout his career. Yet as he looked into Colonel Singh's eyes and processed the implications of the command he had just received, Rajesh found himself confronting questions that his training had not prepared him to answer. The order to detain an elected official using physical force if necessary seemed to cross boundaries that separated legitimate security operations from political oppression. The distinction between protecting democracy and undermining it suddenly seemed less clear than he had always assumed. Senator Khanna continued her approach toward the main entrance, unaware of the specific orders that had been issued regarding her detention. Her rights as an elected official and her reasonable expectation of freedom to leave government buildings created a moral framework that seemed to conflict with the operational directives being implemented throughout the palace. The collision between these competing claims of legitimacy was about to play out in real time with Rajesh as the unwilling arbiter. The documents in Senator Khanna's possession allegedly contained information that could compromise security operations or coordinate resistance to government authority, according to intelligence assessments that had prompted the extraordinary measures being implemented throughout the complex. However, the specific nature of these documents and the evidence supporting claims about their dangerous contents remained classified at levels that excluded most personnel involved in implementing the detention operations. Colonel Singh's expectation of immediate compliance with his orders reflected assumptions about military hierarchy and institutional loyalty that had governed palace security operations for decades. The system of unquestioning obedience had proven effective in managing routine security challenges and maintaining operational discipline during normal circumstances. However, the current situation tested whether such systems could maintain legitimacy when used to implement measures that appeared to contradict fundamental democratic principles. Rajesh's mind raced through the implications of his possible responses to the colonel's command. Compliance would make him a direct participant in actions that seemed to violate the constitutional rights of an elected official, potentially making him legally and morally complicit in what critics might characterize as an authoritarian abuse of power. Refusal to comply would constitute insubordination, with serious consequences for his career and personal circumstances, while potentially undermining security operations that might indeed be necessary for protecting legitimate governmental authority. The weight of 15 years of service pressed upon Rajesh's shoulders as he contemplated decisions that would define not only his own character, but his role in events that would be remembered and analyzed for generations to come. His oath of service had required loyalty to country and constitution, but the current circumstances created ambiguity about which institutions and authorities truly represented those principles in their most authentic form. Senator Khanna reached the final security checkpoint before the main entrance, her progress bringing the theoretical dilemmas facing Rajesh into sharp practical focus. The moment for abstract contemplation was passing rapidly, replaced by the immediate requirement for concrete action or inaction that would have irreversible consequences for all involved. The collision between competing interpretations of duty and legitimacy was about to be resolved through the decisions of individuals rather than institutions. The other security personnel in the vicinity watched the unfolding situation with professional attention while remaining focused on their own assigned responsibilities. Their presence created additional pressure on Rajesh to demonstrate the discipline and obedience that had characterized his long service record, while simultaneously serving as witnesses to whatever actions he might take in response to the colonel's direct order. The collective reputation and effectiveness of the security detail hung in the balance alongside the personal consequences he faced. Colonel Singh's expression remained stern and expectant as he awaited Rajesh's response to the command he had delivered. The security chief's own position and authority were being tested by the unprecedented nature of the operations he had been ordered to implement. His effectiveness as a leader depended partly on maintaining the loyalty and obedience of subordinates like Rajesh, while the broader success of the security operations required coordinated implementation of directives that pushed the boundaries of established precedent. The technological systems that supported palace security operations continued to function normally, providing real-time monitoring and communication capabilities that enabled coordination of complex tactical operations. However, the human element remained the critical factor in determining the success or failure of measures that relied ultimately on individual decisions about legitimate authority and appropriate action. No amount of technological sophistication could substitute for the moral judgment required in situations that existed beyond established protocols. President Sharma remained in her secure offices, monitoring the implementation of operations she had authorized, while fully aware that their success depended on the loyalty and competence of personnel like Rajesh, whom she had never met, but whose actions would help determine the fate of her presidency and the trajectory of democratic governance in the nation. The burden of leadership included responsibility for the consequences of decisions implemented by others acting under her ultimate authority. As Senator Khanna approached within a few steps of Rajesh's position, the moment of truth finally arrived when abstract principles would collide with concrete realities and individual character would be measured against institutional expectations. The command that had echoed through the corridors of power was about to encounter the simple but profound resistance of human conscience expressing itself through a single question that would change everything. Rajesh looked directly into Colonel Singh's eyes, then shifted his gaze to Senator Khanna's approaching figure, and finally back to his commanding officer. The question that formed in his mind carried the weight of 15 years of service, the implications of his oath to protect democratic institutions, and the moral courage required to challenge authority when conscience demanded such action. "Sir," Rajesh said quietly but clearly, his voice carrying across the space between himself and Colonel Singh while remaining audible to Senator Khanna and the other security personnel in the vicinity. Before I implement this order, I need to ask you one question that goes to the heart of what we have sworn to protect." The colonel's expression shifted slightly, showing the first signs of uncertainty as he realized that his direct command was being questioned rather than immediately implemented. The pause that followed Rajesh's words created a moment of suspended tension that would be remembered by all present as the turning point when individual conscience confronted institutional authority with consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate circumstances. "What is your question, Guard Kumar?" Colonel Singh asked, his voice carrying a mixture of impatience and curiosity about what could possibly justify questioning a direct order during such critical operations. Rajesh straightened his shoulders and looked directly into his commanding officer's eyes as he posed the question that would echo through the corridors of history. "Sir, are we protecting democracy, or are we destroying it?" The simple words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, challenging fundamental assumptions about authority, legitimacy, and the proper relationship between security operations and democratic governance. The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer that would define not only the current crisis but the future character of the institutions they served. The moment of truth had arrived, and the response to Rajesh's question would determine whether the shocking command that had echoed through the presidential palace would be implemented as planned or challenged by the moral courage of an individual guard who dared to ask what everyone else was thinking but afraid to voice. The fate of democracy itself hung in the balance, waiting for an answer that would shape the destiny of a nation.